Bonjour tout le monde, on va commencer ce matin notre séance. Bienvenue, je suis Michael Sinatra, le directeur du Centre de recherche interuniversitaire sur les humanités numériques basé à l'Université de Montréal avec nos collègues de Concordia et de McGill. C'est mon grand plaisir de vous accueillir ce matin pour la deuxième séance de notre série conférence midi du CRIHN, cette année avec le département d'anthropologie. Je tiens à remercier Julien, le directeur du département, pour avoir accepté de s'associer au centre cette année pour notre série, et surtout à ma collègue Catherine Cook pour avoir préparé tout ce beau programme avec moi cette année. Et sans plus tarder, je lui passe la parole pour qu'elle introduise notre conférencier aujourd'hui.
Well, it's a huge pleasure to welcome Dr. Genner Llanes-Ortiz to our department this year for a discussion of digital indigeneities. He's currently assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in digital indigeneities at Bishop's University. He obtained his DPhil in social anthropology at the University of Sussex and has since then worked on a range of projects, including indigeneity in the contemporary world at the University of Royal Holloway in London, as well as being an assistant professor in the heritage of Indigenous peoples at the University of Leiden before coming to Bishop's and to Quebec. He's going to be talking a lot about thinking about how we can creatively use digital technologies for reclaiming, revitalizing, and mobilizing heritage and language in Indigenous communities.
Catherine. Kima wol kianen bela ta wetelish yal sibatikish keshum it yolal bashkimeatik yetele tumen nukulino in abay Genner Llanes-Ortiz yala men Catherine quinta tu nos lumil México en lumil ilumile ukabay maya petenil beslay ukabatik Yucatán. Tenemos tu maya winik kin anikin masawat anshan yete kima wol ikil pianon beslay tu lumil le yashka hobo tile luma ti beslay ukabatik Canada chambale yuchben lumen le ganinge haga yetele wendat ichil ulak uchben yete kahobo tibehlai chikima kiwol tianem pelai tawetelish. So just wanted to greet you in my language and also to express my gratitude to everyone for showing up in such interesting weather conditions today. And to say that I'm really happy to be today with you here. My name, like Catherine said, is Genner Llanes-Ortiz. I come from Mexico, and I am a member of the Maya people of the land that is called the Maya Peninsula in our language, and that today is known as the Yucatan. And I greet you today, very honored to be an indigenous guest in these lands who are the lands of many peoples, and the first peoples of this country that is now known as Canada, but that historically were the lands of people like the Kanien'kehá:ka and also the Wendat, many others. And so we're meeting today in these lands, of which I'm a humble guest, and really happy to be here with you today. So my talk is about things that Catherine was saying before. This is a topic which of course is part of my Canada Research Chair. It's a program that I'm trying to develop currently at Bishop's University. But in many ways, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the general context of how I came to think about several different processes of technological retooling, which is in the title of my talk today, as digital indigeneity. One of the first things that I want to say is that the concept of digital indigeneity is in no way my own. I'm not the first person that have used this expression or this concept. It was in fact used for the very first time during a symposium that was celebrated in the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the neighboring country. And that happened in 2013. And at the time, they were using that notion to address different forms of mediation of indigenous content creation, mediation of indigenous storytelling that was happening in digital platforms. So that concept was from the very beginning part of the indigenous studies field. Most of the colleagues working at the time in this university in the United States were from the Chickasaw Nation, or they were from the Chamorro Nation, among others. So it was a concept crafted by indigenous scholars. So the idea was to activate this notion of indigeneity, of starting to unpack the idea of indigeneity in different areas that were, to that point, very strange to discussions of indigenous identities, indigenous languages, or indigenous forms of knowledge. And one of the interesting things for me at that point is that for the most part, the conversation happened across different indigenous contexts where English was the predominant language, right? So we're talking about Aotearoa, New Zealand, Canada, and of course the United States, which is the country where this symposium happened. And if you are interested, you can have a look at that URL, and just to know what kind of discussions were happening in 2013. I knew about this symposium, years later, and in fact, the idea of digital indigeneities came up from a conversation that I first had with the chief curator of the Volkenkunde Museum in Leiden, in the Netherlands. We're just talking about how my work had been, closely looking at different expressions of my identity online, and he threw out this idea. His name is Wayne Modest, and he's a Caribbean origin, and so Wayne told me at that point, I wonder what kind of new ways of representing or new ways of knowing would be embedded in this kind of new uses of technology. And at that point, I thought, oh yeah, actually, Wayne, this is a very interesting idea. I didn't want to, follow that up, and that's how I became interested in this field. And so later, my and I hope that you can see well this slide. Looking for ways of connecting this initial interest with other discussions, I came across this interesting article by media scholar Armida de la Garza. And Armida is a Mexican, a non-indigenous Mexican, who did her PhD in the UK and is now currently working in China. But she was actually quite provocatively looking into the sort of media platforms that different indigenous peoples, especially in this continent, were using before the time of colonization. And you probably know, those of you who are archaeologists or you anthropologists, you probably know that although there's a tendency to conceive indigenous peoples as oral cultures or peoples who rely fundamentally on oral forms of communication, there have been throughout this continent different examples of record keeping that have taken the form, for instance, in the case of my home region, of hieroglyphic writing. So writing, which is text, and other forms of media have always been creatively used and multi-platform in the communicational strategies and knowledge transmission practices of different indigenous peoples in this continent. When looking, for instance, so we see here two images. One is Mixtec codex, and the other is a Nahua codex. So the Nahua and the Mixtec were two nations in what is today South Central Mexico who use pictographic writing in their forms of communication. They kept books They painted very beautifully and also complex scenes and narratives in what is called in Mexico amate paper, which is made from bark and then painted with lime and then applied color and different shapes. So these books, if you look at these books, you see different forms of performativity. You see passages that remind you of sometimes of forms of theater. Sometimes there are inscriptions that are highly abstract in meaning and that could be used then to explain historical passages and political histories, among many other forms of knowledge. But for the most part, these forms of communication didn't really separate art from science or biological knowledge from, say, artistic practices, which means that in many ways they have, and that's what Armida argues, they have a lot in common with digital technologies today, right? If you look at the unstoppable rise of TikTok as a form of knowledge, you can understand how some of these traditions could in some ways be put in relation with what is happening today in terms of digital technologies. So this is the main point that she's trying to make, because indigenous forms of knowledge didn't establish a clear hierarchy between science and arts, and since they were also relied on haptic, which is touch and contact with materials, in many ways, this establishes a continuity with what is happening today in terms of digital technologies. The other important source for me in thinking about digital indigeneities is the work of Ramesh Srinivasan and Adam Fish, who wrote a very interesting book in 2017 called After the Internet. And they very explicitly went out to explore the idea that, all of, you probably remember, if you are my age or, my youth, my level of youth, that at the beginning of this century, there was a lot of enthusiasm. If you think of Manuel Castells and his famous book, The Network Society, he was one of the spreaders of the gospel of the internet as a brand new world, and a brave new world for that matter. So Castells was very optimistic at the beginning of this century about the endless possibilities and the benefits that network society will bring to the world, right? Forms of organization, political protest, and so on, forms of democratization, the e-government, among other things that were part of that conversation at the time. In the last decade particularly, and especially the second half of the last decade, this enchanted us in many ways from those promises of the internet, where we started seeing how the internet was a cesspool of ignorance, and rather than democratizing knowledge and political participation, it became the place where all bad things went to live. So in many ways, the work of Srinivasan and Fish is an intervention, and it challenges these mythological narratives about the internet as a space that is completely autonomous and deterritorialized, right? So what I say is that internet technologies, we have to understand the way they exist or the way they develop as part of assemblages, right? And in this, they go back to Félix Guattari, excuse my pronunciation, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, and I forgot the name of the of his intellectual companion, Guattari and Deleuze. So they wrote about different forms of assemblage that should be useful as an analytical tool to understand social life or an organization. So Srinivasan and Fish, what he says is that in understanding how indigenous peoples are appropriating digital technologies, we shouldn't only be looking at the affordances that digital technologies offer indigenous people. But more than that, we should be looking at how these technologies come to be embedded in political and social contexts where indigenous peoples are constantly transforming their lives, and this takes us to the idea of survivance, which is a notion advanced by different indigenous intellectuals. Among them, I'm sorry, blank with the reference, but it's a notion that is inspired by the work of Deloria Jr., among others, which, and as a concept, the idea of survivance is that proposes that indigenous peoples are in constant processes of transformation, processing new influences, incorporating and expanding these ways of being indigenous in contexts surrounded by colonization and colonialism, but that these strategies are not mere survival strategies, but they are a combination of survival, resistance, and transformation not just of the selves, but also the context in which indigenous peoples find themselves. So in that sense, looking at the internet as an assemblage, inspired me to highlight, emphasize not just how indigenous communities, individuals, and groups adapt to technologies, but how they transform those technologies in the process of using them, right? And that's a notion that I'm currently, trying to explore and understand, and especially for the context of Latin America. So this is a screen capture of one of my first dalliances with the idea of digital indigeneities. This is a report that I had the privilege of writing with those five fine indigenous researchers from different indigenous nations in Latin America. Pedro Cardona, who is a member of the Zapotec Nation, Lisette Atamian, who is from the Awajún in Peru. The Zapotec are the traditional stewards of lands in southern Mexico. The Awajún are one of the first nations of the Amazon in Peru. Then Duban Almendra is from the Misak Nation in Colombia, and Ruben Hilare is from the Aymara people of Bolivia, and finally my very good friend Yasna Aguilar, who is one of the most influential intellectuals today in Mexico. She's from the Mije Nation, and with them we looked into precisely how indigenous peoples in the Americas, particularly in Latin America, were reshaping the digital technologies that they had at their disposal, those that they could appropriate in some ways to promote the indigenous languages. And what we found was really interesting. Some of the findings that came out of that have to be located within the context of Latin America, right? So unlike North America, a very wealthy, actually a very rich region, the Latin American context is marked by an incredible, almost abysmal inequality. I was recently reading about some estimations of income distribution in my own country, and some of those numbers were really appalling. In Mexico, 1%, the top 1% of the richest Mexicans manage or have direct control over 25% of the national income. So you can imagine, the level of inequality that a country which is, in global terms, one of the developing economies in the world, quote unquote, how that growth, economic growth, and wealth is unevenly distributed. So unevenly distributed in my country, in the rest of Latin America as well. So that explains, the lack of access that a lot of people have to the internet. And in spite of that, indigenous people, especially young people, are creatively, relentlessly using digital technologies to communicate their own experiences to the wider world. So another important aspect of the Latin American context is how digital technologies, and not just for Latin America, but also everywhere in the world, come with it's a poisonous fruit, right? So on the one hand, we all know that we can just go online and open an account in any of the global social networks in the world, and that doesn't come with a cost, right? So we don't pay anything to open an account in any of these big platforms today. But what we do pay in return is access, unlimited access to our personal data. Unless we are digital literate, in which case we can maybe negotiate the level of personal information that we offer to these big platforms. So that's especially true in a context marked by high levels of illiteracy, not just digital literacy, but plain literacy in general, which again should make us pause a little bit when thinking about the promises of digital technologies, and think about this in context of political organization or mobilization or social cultural revival. The third consideration to do when it comes to the Latin American context is that in many ways, and in this, I'm following the work of Daniel Miller, who is an anthropologist based at UCL, and he has been with a team of researchers been looking at the social life of digital technologies, right? Which is, and what he has found is that in many ways, rather than digital technologies changing fundamentally the way we relate with each other in different contexts in the world, China, Chile, South Africa, Peru, among other countries, what he and his collaborators, his network of scholars have been able to visualize is that technologies take on very different lives depending on the context and on the country where they find themselves. So for instance, one of the things that they have unveiled is the importance of WhatsApp in the lives of lots of people outside of the global north, right? Me and my wife were living in the Netherlands for 6 years, and we almost never used WhatsApp to do anything of significance. But in Mexico, you can go to the doctor on WhatsApp, and you can get your prescription on WhatsApp, and you can pray on WhatsApp. You can do many things that continue those forms of socialization in digital form. So paying attention to that means that in terms of how we imagine digital technologies being incorporated into the lives of not just indigenous communities, but any community in the world, we should be zooming in on the daily uses and the unexpected forms of adaptation and transformation that happen, in daily life. So in my work, I have been paying close attention to how indigenous forms of knowledge and expression have become increasingly visible and how they are currently being multiplied in the digital world. So this was just to add to why thinking about inequality and exclusion is important. Just to highlight the fact that visibilization and multiplication of content that is related to indigenous knowledge and one of the most important forms of knowledge, which is language, is so important. If we look at the chart that we have here, you can see that it's not just indigenous languages, but many languages, including of course French, are in incredible disadvantage when it comes to the total number of communications that happen online on a daily basis. This is a chart that I created based on statistics offered. I forgot to put the reference there, but it's a website that's called statistica.com, which reports on the most current numbers in terms of global circulation of information and the languages in which this information exists online. So we see here that 25.9% of total online communications in 2021 were in English, 19.4% were in Chinese, and 7.9% were in Spanish. So, 3 languages dominate the internet as of 2021. And then we look at the access that indigenous communities and peoples have in Latin America, and we can see that why this is happening. If 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if 12 languages represent more than 75% of the total online communications in 2021, you can only imagine the percentage that amounts to when it comes to indigenous languages. Hence the important work that indigenous activists using digital technologies do, the contribution that they represent when it comes to this level of communications. Looking at the production and the ways in which indigenous people use not just social media, not just network facilities, etc., but how they are using other forms of digital technology, digitization of information for language promotion and revitalization. The 2016 report that I was mentioning before, that I co-wrote with my 5 indigenous colleagues, allowed us to identify some of the most important processes happening back then. A lot of these activists and scholars were using and continue to use digital media and platforms for different objectives, from language promotion to the dissemination of educational materials, to the returning of ethnographic and audiovisual media to the communities, to the re-examination and the creation of actually an interesting participatory heritage space for indigenous knowledge, to the mobilization and of personal histories and personal narratives about what it means to be indigenous in the 21st century. All of those aspects, as I said before, are of great importance when looking at the global context. So some of the a few of the interesting forms of appropriation that I was able to identify or have been able to sort of approach and especially in that report that we wrote in 2016, was the notion of a digital repatriation happening, in which indigenous people are using the internet and other digital technologies to, on the one hand, reclaim information that had been collected by researchers on the one hand, so allies of indigenous people in places like Colombia and or Peru, who have over the years gathered a lot of information that is today precious to these different communities, and how that has created the space for reintroducing that knowledge in revitalization processes led by indigenous people. So this website, Yadiko Ruki, Itomagaro Wai, which is a project that was supported by the international NGO Global Voices, aimed to do precisely that. They went to, they approached a non-indigenous Colombian researcher who had worked in some of the Witoto-speaking communities in the Colombian Amazon, sorry. And they, decided in consultation with the elders of the community to digitize songs and dances that were recorded in the 1970s and 1980s, and that had since been abandoned or stopped being practiced by communities who wanted to reclaim that knowledge, to recuperate those practices, and therefore, was this is one example of that kind of repatriation. And on the right-hand side, you can see, the work of in some Facebook groups, Maya young scholars, Maya students who have gone to university in the Yucatan or in Guatemala. They have also created fun groups on Facebook where they circulate information that they have learned in university, and they have also, but information that learn to deconstruct and to criticize, to look with critical eyes. So they're not just repeating what they have learned in university, but are actively deconstructing. You may even say decolonizing, although they are not necessarily engaged with the decolonization process, but they are nonetheless reintroducing certain forms of knowledge into the community, and this is something that perhaps is familiar. In that same process, different people are re-examining forms of heritage. Again, along with the repatriation of this knowledge, what they are also doing is engaging critically with that knowledge, reintroducing not just knowledge from the past, but sort of reporting from the ground, from the grassroots, about what is happening and how different people experience their own sense of being an indigenous person in today's world. So on the one hand, and because media, especially mass media, we saw the pie chart before, and when we look at just any cable channel in North America, or let alone not to mention North America, where in this country you have, for instance, a dedicated channel for indigenous content. We don't have that in any country in Latin America. We don't have APTN or anything like that, where indigenous languages or indigenous knowledge could be directly communicated by people. So the re-examination and the re-engagement with indigenous knowledge often happens in YouTube channels. that different indigenous actors, different indigenous people have adopted quite a lot of creativity as well. We have true indigenous influences in Latin America, in Brazil, in Peru, in Mexico, in Guatemala, as well as others that have in recent years come to the forefront here in North America. So the re-examination of that heritage means that there's a critical examining that happens, which is also diverse in terms of generations, and that have, for the most part, as we see, so that's a screen capture of a young Rapa Nui woman who created her own TikTok account to communicate the experience of being a member of the Rapa Nui people. And you probably wonder, who are the Rapa Nui? So the Rapa Nui are the people who are the first inhabitants of the Easter Island, which is in the middle of the Pacific, and it belongs to Chile today, right? So it's part of the Chilean nation state. And Paloma was very successful at communicating different aspects of her own culture in her own terms, and to gather a good number of followers, right? But that's not just it's not just YouTube or TikTok, and it's not just about not just necessarily about the experiences or the contemporary experiences of indigenous people today. An interesting process that I've come across in recent years, and I was just talking with Catherine before this talk, is how social media has become a school for young Maya people to relearn hieroglyphic writing, and how they are recreating that writing online, creating their own new forms to represent contemporary languages. Some of you, perhaps, if you are archaeology students, perhaps know that the language in which hieroglyphic inscriptions were written is no longer spoken by any living community in the Maya region, which means that innovations have to be made to be able to represent contemporary languages in the Maya world. And that's exactly what is happening. And social media is, in that sense, an important school where people are constantly contributing to the growth of this knowledge. Another important transformation that is happening, both in terms of the homogeneity of online communications, as well as the sort of images that the public associate with indigenous peoples, is that because now there are few obstacles for communication, quote unquote, right? So I say few, quote unquote, because of course there are issues of digital literacy that need to be considered, but for the most part, and through incredible inventiveness and resourcefulness, indigenous young people are constantly appropriating these media without having a proper school to do that. So they are, experimenting, posting, spreading their own personal experiences, which multiplies the voices and allows, to some extent, many of the underrepresented members of indigenous societies to have valid access to other people who are the same, or just people who want to know more and listen with respect about experiences that these communities are having in the 21st century. So this is what we see today, the proliferation of indigenous voices, indigenous faces as well, different forms of scholarship, as some scholars have put it, looking at the presence of indigenous people online. Indigenous bodies are occupying spaces that were before reserved for other forms of identity. So this increases, the diversity of representation of what it means to be an indigenous person in this century, which altogether, if we consider this in terms of scholarship, what comes to mind is a growing and very complex process of participatory curation of indigenous heritage online, right? So here, participatory heritage should be understood as space created by non-experts, which of course will challenge, in some instances, will present important challenges and disruptions to the knowledge that experts often would like to see represented in media, but that originates from. I'm just gonna perhaps close this window here, right? If that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that people can see the whole quote. Sorry. Okay. So what digital participatory curation represents is, a bottom-up process of multiplying perspectives online, right? Something that in many ways transforms not just indigenous communities, but also the online representational space. Something that I'm really interested in observing and perhaps even at some point measuring, if that's even possible. So collaborations are bottom up in nature, and they are more individualistic, but at the same time can also take on collective forms. But what is important is that they exist outside of institutions. The other way in which, and this is more clearly, it has become more clearly important in recent years, is how interventions by indigenous people of certain technologies like mapping are gradually changing the way we perceive space, right? So, you're probably familiar with this project, nativeland.ca, which exists online. It has its own website, but at the same time, is also an app that allows anybody, just anybody with this app, to know who are the traditional stewards and the First Nations of the lands that people are occupying today. And digital mapping has grown exponentially in the last decade, particularly, and indigenous communities, scholars, and organizations have taken to this mapping with particular enthusiasm, so that we see compilation and edited book that came up in 2029 called Digital Mapping in Indigenous America. Was able to identify all of these different instances, history maps made by Native Americans, healing and reconciliation projects related to boarding and residential schools, language and land reclamation, Western cartography maps created in alliance with the indigenous nations, as well as, and this is for me the most interesting example or use of these digital maps. Maps that combine narrative, art, film, along with chapters on archaeology, place naming, and the digital voice of elders, because I think that those are very effective ways of reinscribing indigenous knowledge into the landscape, and also expanding that knowledge, being able to communicate that knowledge in a more performative and multimodal way. So for me, those are interesting transformations currently at place. But of course, these come with important caveats. And so there are a series of challenges, three of which have been identified by Hess in the introduction to this book, and that are related to the challenge of unmappability, which is how you represent practice in a map, which tends to fixate or to sort of limit the record that's created, right? And there might be ways of doing that, but we're just beginning to understand how to do it. And this is about particularly how situated and embodied knowledge comes to be represented in maps, however digital or however interactive. Then there is the challenge of that comes with data sovereignty and repatriation. Who gets access to this information, and therefore how does this information become relevant for other publics, but fundamentally for the main interested parties in this knowledge, who are indigenous nations, right? So the questions about repatriation are important in this way. And finally, the concern with collaborative and respectful stewardship of this knowledge, in the sense of how we guarantee that this knowledge is not going to be misused or employed for how we guarantee that this knowledge is not going to negatively impact indigenous communities or marginalized communities. So those are important to consider. So the question of digital indigeneities and indigenous futures or indigenous digital futures is important. With this, I'm just closing. On the one hand, one of the main points that I want to make is that the appropriation by indigenous peoples of these digital technologies should not surprise us. As I said before, these are very correspondent. This are actually in tune, congruent with surveillance strategies that have existed, that indigenous nations have implemented since the beginning of colonization in these lands. We should be attentive to the increasing protagonism that different indigenous actors, collective, individual, institutional, community-based, are performing, the protagonism that they have in pushing for cultural preservation and self-representation, which we should be, as scholars, as researchers, be paying close attention to. And in this, I know that networks of digital humanities often have this how to say this inspiration, right? So they see a technology and wonder how this technology could be of use for certain purposes, which is of course very, very valid, right? So we are scholars, we engage in research. But when it comes to indigenous communities, I think that the question about what digital technology is more advantageous to indigenous peoples should be reversed, and instead we should perhaps start wondering how indigenous peoples are using these digital technologies, and therefore, and based on that realization, perhaps the next step will be, how can then we support best these transformations that indigenous peoples want to see in digital technological development, right? And as what I just said before, we should also keep our ears and our minds close to questions about intellectual property and potential misappropriation. Those are very important questions. when it comes to the work of indigenous influences, in particular, there are questions of personal harm, personal and cultural harm that could be part of our research, or should be, questions that we should be asking ourselves. Also looking for forms of supporting these indigenous influences who are exposed to racist attacks online. So we know cyberbullying and many other negative effects of social media and digital communication. And importantly, although this is a more delicate matter, the questions about who have where the authorized voices are when it comes to particular forms of knowledge, right? The paradox of in the field of digital indigeneities is that it's generally the younger generation who in many ways deserve to be heard, not just outside, but also inside their own communities. These are the ones who have the greatest protagonism. They are at the forefront of the work that indigenous people do with digital technologies. But that means that there are forms of knowledge and internally authorized knowledge that is relegated, and that's the knowledge of the older generation, people who are perhaps those who have more authority in terms of keeping these forms of knowledge, and that so questions about how to bridge that gap are for me important in the development of my research. So this is by way of conclusion. To think about digital technologies is to think about how indigenous people are retooling, repurposing these technologies, from an emphasis on text, digital text, and artificial intelligence towards forms of multimodality, and and the need also to invest more and to do a better work at linking research and technological development with indigenous perspectives, and also questions about how to maintain the link between technology and community in processes that protect the knowledge of indigenous elders and other specialists, and how to guarantee the right of indigenous peoples and the communities to benefit from technological advancement in the world today. And with this, I would like to thank you for your time, and to open the space for questions.